The movie American Dreamz does an amazing job of showing how politics work in modern day, and why the president has to try so much harder to gain mass approval. The movies focus around the concept that in order to be popular with voters, the president must be heavily placed in the public eye. And even if he is not in the public eye for good reasons, like reading newspapers to learn more about what's going on overseas, just being in the public eye makes for higher approval ratings than being a good president. The three main issues that come up in American Dreamz include how much advising is too much for a president, how the president can present yourself as a strong, smart leader in public, and how, as a president, do you keep away from mass media corruption. The first main issue that arises in American Dream is the intelligence level of President Stanton. He is shown from the beginning of the movie to be relatively dumb when it comes to foreign affairs. He asks his chief of staff if he knew that there are three types of Irakistans, and is shocked to find out that it is common knowledge. The way in which Stanton talks and acts makes it clear that he is being related to George W. Bush. Bush is a prime example of how far the intelligence of American presidents has fallen. In an article in the National Review about the intelligence of presidents, it is stated that Bush is smarter than most of the people that call him dumb. This is why he is able to get away with his lack of intelligence, and this is shown just as much in the movie by how dumb the U.S. people appear to be. One of the best examples of President Stanton's lack of knowledge and speaking ability comes when he's meeting with the premier of China. During this meeting, he tells the premier that he has nightmares about North Korea attacking, which is not smart because it makes the United States seem weak. A final huge example of just how incapable the president is illustrated during a scene where he's talking on stage at American Dreamz. His chief of staff has him put a microphone in his ear so he can tell him everything to say while he's on stage, and during his speaking on stage, they receive interference because a worker is using a walkie-talkie. The chief of staff tells him to turn the freaking thing off, and the president yells the exact same thing on stage. This shows that the president is nothing more than a puppet that just does and says exactly what he is told. Although President Stanton is not that smart, a lot of his lack of knowledge seems to come from the fact that his chief of staff advises him too much, to a point where when he's even trying to gain knowledge for himself, he is stopped. The issue between the two comes from the fact that Stanton's chief of staff attempts to completely control everything that the president says and does. This is a major issue because he prevents the president from learning things that he should know as a president. One example of this control comes at the beginning of the movie, right after the president gets elected to his second term. The scene shows that the president is in bed reading newspapers. Find out rapidly that the president is not very smart when he uses the terms like Irakistans, but it is shown that he's attempting to gain more knowledge by reading these newspapers. Chief of Staff quickly dismisses the president's desire to learn and tells him that all the information he needs to know is in his weekly briefings. Another great example of how the Chief of Staff does the president's thinking for him comes up when he provides the president with a mini microphone for his ear that allows the Chief of Staff to tell the president literally everything to say. This is one of the scariest parts of the movie because it shows just how little it really matters who we vote for. Because most of the time we're not even hearing the president's own words, we're hearing what his speechwriters tell him to say or what people are whispering in his ears. Even though Stanton's chief of staff is the primary controller of the president, both he and the president let the appeal of media sway them in several different ways. The first example of this for the president comes from his obsession with the newspapers and what they're saying. In one scene we find the president hidden away in his room, still in his PJs, with stacks and stacks of newspapers from all around him, and he's even reading the Canadian press. While there are other smaller examples of media corrupting politics, the most apparent and central example of media corruption comes from Stanton's chief of staff cutting a deal with Martin Tweed, who is the host of a popular TV show called American Dreamz, which is essentially American Idol. This deal-making is a prime example of one of the 10 propositions about the president and media that is discussed by Dan F. Hans in his article, The Media Presidency 10 Propositions. In the article, one of the propositions is that television has personalized politics. The most significant point to be made about television as compared to printed media is that it is personality dominated. It deals with political figures, not political institutes, and is first and foremost the president's instrument. In the deal discussed in the movie, the chief of staff convinces Tweed to put the president on the show as a guest host. The reason that they want the president on the show has nothing to do with real politics or helping the nation as a whole. but instead as a way of getting the president's approval ratings higher and giving him more personal appeal. The media also has a big part in how we view presidents. It is very clear in the movie that President Stanton is not very smart, but when he's in front of the camera, it's made opposite, or the opposite is made true. A real life example of this comes from the Journal of American Cultures in an article called "The Media Frontier Constitution or Construction of President George W. Bush" by Ron Malthus. In this article, he discusses the cowboy image that media puts onto Bush during his presidency. President Bush essentially ran his presidential campaign on the Western platform, and his supporters wore cowboy hats emblazoned with Bush to further link his character to the famous and mythical cowboy. As the nation gets dumber, so does its leader. An American Dream is a shocking look at where our nation could be heading if we don't take steps to fix the problem. This film shows that we need a leader that has intelligence and can make choices for himself, but can still benefit from the knowledge that advisors give him. Knowing how to balance the advice you are given and your own thoughts is quite difficult, but unless we have more presidents that can figure out the balance, I'm worried that the fictional situation that happens in American Dreams can turn into a real American nightmare.